The cold was a constant companion. It lived in the stones of her cottage, in the damp wool of her blanket, and in the marrow of her bones. Alara had long since stopped fighting it. She simply endured it, another hardship in a life stitched together from them. She was an outcast, a woman living on the forgotten edge of the forgotten Isle of Skye, in a kingdom of wolves who valued strength above all else. She had none. Her only skills were with herbs and poultices, a gentle magic in a world of savage force. The villagers in the island's single huddled port town tolerated her existence only because she could mend a fever or set a bone better than anyone else. They paid her in fish heads and stale bread, and she was grateful for it. Gratitude was another thing she had learned to endure. The storm that brought him was a monster. It clawed at her little cottage, screaming through the cracks in the walls. The sea, usually a distant roar, became a ravenous beast, devouring the shore. Alara spent the night huddled by her hearth, feeding it driftwood, praying the roof would hold. She was used to being alone, but in storms like this, the loneliness felt sharp, a physical presence in the room with her. When the fury finally passed with the dawn, she ventured out. The world was remade in gray devastation. The shore was a graveyard of splintered trees and mangled seaweed, and half buried in the black, wet sand, there was a man. Her first instinct was fear. It coiled in her gut, cold and slick. Strangers were never good news. They were tax collectors, or recruiters for the king's endless wars, or worse. But he was unmoving. The tide was coming in, its greedy fingers already stroking the hem of his dark tunic. To leave him was to condemn him. She hesitated for only a moment. Her compassion, the one part of her the world had not managed to grind down, won out. She scrambled down the rocky path, her worn boots slipping on the wet stones. He was massive, built on a scale that seemed unnatural. Broad shoulders, a chest like a barrel, limbs thick with muscle. Even unconscious and half-drowned, he radiated a sense of power that was terrifying. His face was turned away, pressed into the sand. Dark hair plastered to his skull with seawater and blood. A deep gash ran from his temple down his jaw, ugly and raw. She placed trembling fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. It was there. Faint, thready, but a stubborn drumbeat of life against the roar of the sea. Getting him back to the cottage was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man. She dragged him, inch by painstaking inch, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning with the salty air. She fell twice, her knees scraping raw on the rocks, but she did not stop. She could not. Something in his stillness called to a deep, wounded part of her own soul. Inside, she collapsed onto the floor beside him, gasping for breath. The fire was nearly out. She fed it her last precious pieces of dry wood until it blazed back to life, casting flickering shadows across his harsh, beautiful face. Now, in the warm light, she could see him properly. He was not just powerful, he was magnificent. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had forgotten how to smile. Scars crisscrossed his skin, old white lines that told stories of 100 battles. She worked with a desperate focus, cutting away his ruined tunic. His torso was a landscape of honed muscle and more scars. A brutal, deep wound wept blood on his side, likely from a shattered spar of a ship. It was jagged and angry. She cleaned it as best she could with boiled water and her strongest antiseptic herbs, her hands surprisingly steady. She stitched the flesh together with a fine gut thread, her movements precise and practiced. He never stirred, lost in a place she could not reach. For 3 days he was a ghost in her home. He burned with fever, his breath coming in ragged rasps. She bathed his face with cool cloths, forced sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and changed the dressing on his wound until her own fingers were stained with his blood. She slept in a chair by his cot, waking at every pained sound he made. In his delirium, he muttered words she couldn't understand, his voice a low thunder that vibrated through the small room. Sometimes he would cry out a name, Lyra. It was a cry of such profound agony that it made her own chest ache in sympathy. On the fourth morning, she woke to find him watching her. His eyes were open. They were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see right through her. The fever had broken. The clarity in his gaze was absolute and utterly unnerving. She froze, the clay mug in her hand trembling. Fear, which had been a dull hum in the background, returned with a vengeance. He was awake. He was a stranger. He was a giant in her tiny home. Where am I? His voice was rough, a gravelly sound from disuse, but it held an undeniable note of command. It was not a voice that was used to asking questions. It was a voice that was used to being obeyed. "The Isle of Skye," she whispered, her own voice barely audible. "You washed ashore. There was a storm." He pushed himself up on one elbow, hissing as the movement pulled at the stitches in his side. His eyes scanned the small cottage, taking in the drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the single cot, the stone hearth. There was nothing of value here. There was nothing here but her. His gaze returned to her face, and she felt a blush creep up her neck. She was painfully aware of her frayed dress, the smudges of soot on her cheek, the wild tangle of her brown hair. "You did this?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the neat stitches on his side. She nodded, unable to speak. He lay back down, a complicated expression on his face. It wasn't gratitude. It was something more guarded, more assessing. "My name is Theron," he said, the name a simple statement of fact. He offered nothing else. No home, no title, no explanation for how he had come to be broken on her shore. "I am Alara." She offered her own name in return. It felt small and insignificant compared to the weight of his. The days that followed were a strange, quiet dance. Theron was a silent patient. He did as she asked, drinking the broths she made, allowing her to tend his wounds, but he rarely spoke. He watched her. His gray eyes followed her every movement as she ground herbs, stoked the fire, or mended her worn clothes. It wasn't a threatening gaze, but it was intense, unnervingly focused. She felt seen in a way she never had before, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. She learned him not through words, but through small things. She learned the way his jaw tightened when his side pained him. She learned that he preferred her bitterest healing teas over the sweeter ones. She learned that he slept facing the door, even in his exhaustion, one hand always resting near an invisible weapon. He was a warrior, that much was obvious. A man forged in violence. Yet, with her, he was gentle. One evening, as she reached for a bundle of herbs on a high shelf, the rickety stool she was on wobbled. Before she could fall, his hand shot out, steadying her with a firm grip on her arm. His touch was warm, solid. It sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with fear. His skin was calloused, but the pressure was careful, controlled. "Be careful," he murmured, his voice low. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, the cold distance in them was replaced by something else, something warmer, something that made her heart skip a beat. She pulled away quickly, her face burning. "Thank you." He said nothing, but the moment lingered in the air between them, thick and charged. He healed with the unnatural speed of his kind. Werewolves, even the lowest of them, were resilient. Within a week, he was walking, albeit stiffly. He began to help her, his strength making her daily chores effortless. He chopped a winter's worth of wood in a single afternoon, his axe splitting the logs with clean, powerful strokes. He repaired the section of her roof the storm had damaged, moving with a sure-footed grace that defied his size. He never spoke of his past, and she never asked. His silence was a wall, and she was too afraid of what lay behind it to try and climb it. She invented a story for him in her mind. He was a soldier, perhaps, or a king's guard who had been shipwrecked. A man running from something. It was easier than confronting the vast unknown truth of him. One night, a fever returned, not from his wound, but from a deep chill that seemed to emanate from within him. He shivered violently, his teeth chattering, though the cottage was warm. She piled every blanket she owned on top of him, but it did no good. The cold was inside him. In his delirium, he thrashed, his powerful limbs tangling in the blankets. He cried out again, that same name, Lyra. This time, it was followed by a broken sob that tore through the quiet of the cottage. Forgive me. Impulsively, she sat on the edge of the cot and placed her hand on his forehead. It was ice cold. A chilling, unnatural frost seemed to cling to his skin. She could feel the shivers racking his massive frame. He was in agony. It's all right, she found herself whispering, her voice soft. You're safe. She didn't know if he could hear her. She wasn't sure why she was saying it, but the words felt true. In this small, isolated world of her cottage, she could keep him safe. She began to hum. It was an old, wordless melody her mother had sung to her as a child, one of the few good memories she had. A simple, soothing tune. She hummed it quietly, her voice a fragile thread of sound in the night. Slowly, miraculously, the shivering began to subside. The tension in his body eased. He turned his head toward the sound, his breathing deepening. She kept humming, her hand still on his forehead, feeling the unnatural cold slowly recede, replaced by a normal human warmth. He fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, the first she had seen him have. She stayed there for a long time, her voice a low, continuous note. There was a strange resonance in the air, a feeling of rightness, as if her voice was a key, and it had just turned a lock she hadn't known existed. She felt a flicker of something inside her, a dormant warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a feeling she didn't understand, and it scared her more than his silence ever had. When he woke the next morning, the chill was gone. He looked at her with a new expression in his gray eyes. The careful assessment was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded curiosity. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I just hummed." He didn't press her, but something had shifted between them. The wall of his silence had a crack in it. He began to talk, not about his past, but about small things. He asked her about the herbs she gathered, listening intently as she explained their properties. He told her stories of the mainland, of vast forests and towering mountains, describing them with a poet's detail that seemed at odds with the warrior's body he inhabited. She found herself talking too. She told him about her lonely life on the Isle, about the villagers' suspicion, about her quiet love for the wild, untamed beauty of her home. He listened without judgment, his gaze never leaving her face. With him, she did not feel small or insignificant. She felt heard. One afternoon, while they were gathering mussels on the beach, he stopped and turned to her. The wind whipped strands of her hair across her face, and he reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking them behind her ear. His touch was electric. It lingered on her skin long after he had pulled his hand away. "You are not like them," he said, his voice a low rumble over the crash of the waves. "The people in the village. They think I'm weak," she said, the admission tasting like ash. "Because I cannot shift. Because my hands are for mending, not fighting." "Kindness is not weakness," he said, his eyes intense. "And your hands? They perform a different kind of magic." He looked down at his side, at the scar that was now a thin silver line against his tanned skin. A magic that saved my life. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one had ever called her magic. They had called her useless, strange, an omega kin with no worth. The simple words from this stranger, this man of mysteries, felt like a balm on wounds she hadn't even known she carried. She was falling for him. The realization was as terrifying as the storm that had brought him. She was a nobody, a healer on a rock in the middle of the sea. He was something more, something vast and dangerous. To give her heart to him was madness. It was to invite a pain greater than any loneliness she had ever known. But it was too late. He had already found his way into the barricaded corners of her soul. She saw it in the way her breath caught when he smiled, a rare, fleeting thing that transformed his harsh face. She felt it in the way she looked for him when she woke, a primal sense of relief flooding her when she saw him by the fire. He had become the center of her small world. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, in the way he found excuses to be near her, to let their hands brush. The air between them was constantly charged, a humming tension that was both exquisite and agonizing. They were two solitary creatures who had forgotten what it felt like not to be alone, and the discovery was potent. One evening, he caught her hand as she passed him, his grip gentle but firm. He pulled her to a stop, his gray eyes searching hers in the firelight. "Alara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. He seemed to be struggling with himself, a war raging behind his eyes. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but whatever he was going to say was lost. A sound from outside cut through the night, the heavy, rhythmic beat of horses' hooves, accompanied by the jingle of armor. It was a sound that did not belong on her quiet, forgotten island. Theron's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a chillingly familiar coldness. He released her hand and rose to his full height, his body tensing like a wolf scenting danger. He moved to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice flat and hard. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders in life-or-death situations. It was not the voice of the man who had tucked her hair behind her ear. Heavy, pounding fists hammered on her door. "Open in the name of the king!" a voice bellowed. Ilara's blood ran cold. The king's guard. Here. For him? Theron didn't answer. He looked back at her, and his expression was one of profound, soul-deep regret. "I am sorry, Elara," he said, and the words were a death knell to the fragile world they had built. He opened the door. Standing on her threshold were 5 men clad in the black and silver armor of the Alpha King's elite royal guard. Their wolf-head helms were tucked under their arms, their faces grim and weary. But when they saw Theron, their expressions transformed into ones of pure, unadulterated relief. The leader, a grizzled warrior with a scar that bisected his eyebrow, dropped to one knee. The others followed suit immediately, their heads bowed in supplication. "Your Majesty," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought you were lost. The entire kingdom has been searching." "Your Majesty." The words echoed in the sudden ringing silence of the cottage. Alara stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing, what she was hearing. Theron. Her Theron. The quiet, wounded man she had nursed back to health. The man whose smile made her heart ache. He was the king. The Alpha King. Theron the Wolf-Hearted. The ruler of the Isles. A man spoken of in whispers. A creature of legend. A ruthless, cold-blooded monarch who had crushed rebellions and conquered lands. A king who had not been seen in public for years, who ruled from his stone fortress on the capital Isle, a remote and terrifying figure. Her mind reeled. The scars, the command in his voice, the way he moved like a predator. It all clicked into place, A horrifying, sickening puzzle. He hadn't been a soldier. He had been a king in disguise. He had lied to her. With every moment of silence, with every shared glance, he had been lying. Theron, the king, looked at her, his face a mask of stone. The gentle man she had known was gone, replaced by this formidable, untouchable monarch. "You will come with us," he said. It was not a request, it was a royal decree. She felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Betrayal was a bitter, icy thing in her throat. She had been a fool. A naive, lonely fool who had opened her heart to a lie. She had nursed a wolf back to health, only to realize he was the leader of the entire savage pack. And now he was going to devour her world. The journey to the capital, a grim fortress of black rock called the Eyrie, was a blur of misery. She was given a horse and a warm cloak, but the finery felt like a mockery. She rode in silence, surrounded by the stoic royal guard with Theron at their head. He never looked back at her. Not once. He was the king again, and she was nothing. A piece of flotsam he had picked up and was now carrying back to his castle. The Eyrie was as cold and imposing as its master. Towers of dark granite clawed at the sky, and the wind howled through its battlements like a grieving spirit. The court was a sea of unfamiliar faces, nobles and warriors who stared at her with open curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. She was a commoner, a nobody, brought into their midst by the king himself. They smelled weakness on her, and their whispers followed her like biting flies. Theron installed her in a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire cottage. They were filled with silk sheets, velvet curtains, and gilded furniture. It felt like a cage, a beautiful, luxurious cage. He posted 2 guards outside her door. For her protection, he said. It felt like imprisonment. He came to her that first night. He had shed the simple leather tunic she knew and was dressed in the severe black and silver of his station. A simple silver circlet rested on his brow. He looked every inch the king, and a universe away from the man she had healed. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of his authority. She couldn't look at him. She stared at the roaring fire in the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. "Why did you lie to me?" "I did not lie," he said. "I simply did not tell you the whole truth." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Is that what kings call it?" She finally met his gaze, her own eyes burning with unshed tears of anger and hurt. "You let me care for you. You let me think you were just a man, Theron. Not this." She gestured around the opulent room at the symbol of his power. "When I am with you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I am just a man. That is the problem. I don't understand." He took a step closer and she flinched back. The movement, small as it was, hit him like a physical blow. His face tightened. "There are reasons for what I do. Reasons for my isolation. A curse runs in my bloodline, Alara. An old and vicious thing." He looked away from her then, staring into the flames as if seeing a ghost. "My ancestor, the first Wolf King, betrayed a powerful witch. In her rage, she cursed our blood. She decreed that any true love felt by the king would turn his inner beast into an uncontrollable monster. It would feed on that love, growing stronger and more savage until it consumed him entirely. And then he would die." He turned back to her, his gray eyes filled with a bleakness that stole her breath. "My father loved my mother. I watched it kill him. I watched his beast, twisted by the curse, destroy everything he held dear before it finally destroyed him. Lyra was my sister. She tried to save him. The beast did not recognize her. The name, Lyra. Forgive me." Alara felt a wave of nausea, the agony she had heard in his voice. It hadn't been for a lover. It had been for his sister, whom his own father had killed. I swore I would never let that happen, Theron continued, his voice raw. I have ruled for 100 years alone. I have felt nothing. I have kept my kingdom safe by keeping my heart locked in ice. And then I washed up on your shore. He looked at her, and the mask of the king was gone, replaced by the vulnerable man she had known. You thawed the ice, Alara, and now, the curse is waking up. My love is a death sentence. For me. The confession hung in the air, more shocking than the revelation of his kingship. He loved her, and it was going to kill him. The cold she had felt on him that night, the delirium, it hadn't been a fever. It had been the curse, stirring for the first time in a century. Then send me away, she whispered, her heart breaking. If my being here is hurting you, send me back to my island. I can't, he said, the words torn from him. That is the cruelty of it. I know it will kill me, and yet, I cannot let you go. His pain was a tangible thing in the room. She saw now that his coldness, his distance since they arrived, wasn't a rejection. It was a desperate act of self-preservation. He was trying to fight his feelings for her to stay alive. A flicker of hope ignited in her chest. A foolish, stubborn thing. I am a healer, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Curses are a kind of sickness. Perhaps I can find a way to fight it. A woman entered the room then, without knocking. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. She wore the dark robes of the court seer. Forgive my intrusion, Your Majesty, the old woman said, her voice like dry leaves skittering on stone. She looked at Alara with a gaze that was both pitying and dismissive. But you must not give the girl false hope. The curse is absolute. I have studied it for decades. There is no cure. Morwen, Theron said, his tone respectful. This is Alara, the woman who saved my life. The seer, Morwen, gave a slight bow of her head. I am grateful for your service to the king, child. But his life is now in more danger than it ever was in that storm. She turned her sharp eyes back to Theron. You must send her away, my king, before it is too late. Your control is already slipping. The council feels it. The very stones of this castle feel it. Leave us, Theron commanded, his voice sharp. Morwen bowed again and retreated, her presence lingering like a bad omen. Alara shivered. There was something about the old woman, a coldness that had nothing to do with the castle's stones. The days that followed were a special kind of torture. Theron kept her close, but at a distance. He would have meals with her, the two of them sitting at opposite ends of a ridiculously long table, the silence stretching between them. He would walk with her in the castle's desolate gardens, their hands never touching. He was fighting a war within himself, and she was the battlefield. She saw the toll it was taking. Dark circles appeared under his eyes. His temper, once so controlled, became frayed. He would snap at his guards, his voice like the crack of a whip. The court began to whisper more loudly. They blamed her, the commoner who had somehow bewitched their cold, untouchable king. She was a witch, a seductress, a bad omen. The words were like stones, and she had no shield against them. Only Morwen showed her any kindness. The old seer would seek her out, offering her cryptic advice and sad smiles. He is a good king, Morwen would say. He suffers for his people. It is a noble sacrifice. She spoke of the curse with a grim authority, explaining its mechanisms, its history. She seemed to know everything about it. But Alara, the healer, saw things differently. She saw a disease, and she refused to believe it was incurable. She spent her days in the royal library, a vast, dusty cavern of forgotten knowledge. She devoured books on ancient magic, blood curses, and forgotten rituals. The librarians, ancient wolves themselves, watched her with suspicion, but they obeyed the king's order that she be given access to everything. She found fragments, whispers of hope. Curses tied to bloodlines could sometimes be broken by an external power, a magic the curse did not recognize. But what power? She had nothing. Meanwhile, Theron grew worse. The internal cold would seize him more frequently now. He would lock himself in his chambers for hours, and she would stand outside the door, hearing his pained gasps, feeling the unnatural chill seep under the door. Her quiet humming, the trick that had worked in the cottage, no longer seemed to have any effect. The curse was growing stronger as his feelings for her deepened, just as the prophecy had foretold. One afternoon, Morwen found her in the library, poring over a crumbling scroll. "You are wasting your time, child," the seer said, her voice soft but firm. "You cannot fight fate." "I don't believe in fate," Alara shot back, her frustration making her bold. "I believe in sickness and cures." "There is one cure," Morwen said, her dark eyes glittering, "but it is not one you would like. If you were to leave, to truly break his heart, the curse might recede. It feeds on love. Starve it." The suggestion was a knife in Alara's chest. To save him by destroying him? By leaving him alone again in his icy prison? "No," she whispered. "There has to be another way." Morwen sighed, a theatrical sound of deep sadness. "So be it. But his fate, and the fate of this kingdom, will be on your hands." The confrontation the court had been waiting for finally came during the winter feast. The great hall was filled with the highest-ranking wolves in the kingdom, alphas of their territories, powerful and proud. They watched Theron with worried eyes. He sat on his throne, a grim, silent figure, the very air around him shimmering with a contained, dangerous energy. He had barely spoken a word all night. Alara sat at his side, in the seat reserved for the queen, a place that made her feel like an imposter. The lords and ladies ignored her, their disdain a palpable force. One of them, a haughty lord named Malik whose lands bordered the king's, finally rose to his feet, his goblet of wine held high. "A toast," he said, his voice ringing with false cheer, "to our king. May he soon find the strength to rid himself of the common burdens that distract him from his duties." The insult was clear. Every eye in the hall turned to her. She felt her face burn with shame. She was the common burden. She was the distraction. The humiliation was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. She saw Theron's hands clench into fists on the arms of his throne. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that made the very goblets on the table vibrate. The temperature in the hall dropped by 10 degrees. But before he could speak, Morwen stepped forward, her face a mask of concern. "Lord Malik is indelicate," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "But his heart is in the right place. We are all worried, Your Majesty. This woman, she does not understand our ways. She is a danger to you, to us all. Her presence here is an affront to the sacred laws." Morwen turned her gaze on Alara, and for the first time, the mask of kindness was gone. Her eyes were filled with a triumphant ancient malice. "She is a charlatan, a worthless stray who has somehow poisoned our king's mind with her base, common magics. The injustice of it all, the lies, the scorn, the hatred, it was too much. All the pain of her life, the loneliness, the feeling of being worthless, it all coalesced into a single point of unbearable pressure inside her. She had saved him. She loved him. And they were going to let him die, all while blaming her for it. Something inside her broke. A sound tore from her throat. It was not a word. It was not a cry. It was a scream of pure, undiluted agony and rage. It was the sound of a lifetime of being told she was nothing, finally refusing to be silent. The sound wave was a physical force. It slammed through the great hall, shattering every goblet, extinguishing every torch. A massive tapestry depicting the first Wolf King ripped from the wall. The stone floor beneath her feet cracked, and in Theron, it triggered a cataclysm. His control, already stretched to its breaking point by the curse and his love for her, snapped. His scream echoed hers, but it was a sound of transformation, of a beast breaking its chains. His body contorted, shadows pouring off him like smoke. The king was gone. In his place stood the beast. It was a nightmare given form. Taller than any man, made of shifting shadow and raw fury, with eyes that burned like coals from the heart of a dying star. It was not a wolf. It was the essence of a wolf's rage, a force of nature given monstrous shape. It let out a roar that shook the castle to its foundations. It paid no mind to the terrified nobles scrambling to escape. Its burning eyes were fixed on one thing, the source of the sound that had unleashed it, on her. But it wasn't a look of recognition. It was a look of mindless, destructive rage. It lashed out, not at her, but at the perceived threat. One of its shadowy claws, as long as a sword, smashed into the stone wall of the hall. The wall exploded outward. The ancient watchtower connected to it groaned, shuddered, and then collapsed into a mountain of rubble and dust. The beast had leveled a building with a single, careless swipe. Panic erupted. The lords and ladies fled, their pride forgotten in their terror. The royal guard charged in, forming a line, their swords and spears looking like children's toys against the monster. The beast swatted them aside, sending armored men flying like dolls. It was unstoppable. It was going to tear the entire castle apart. It was going to kill everyone, and Theron was lost inside it. Morwen was watching, a horrific, triumphant smile on her ancient face. She had wanted this. She had engineered it. In that moment, Alara knew. Morwen wasn't a seer trying to help. She was the witch who had laid the curse. But that didn't matter now. All that mattered was the monster in the center of the room, a creature born of love and pain that was about to destroy itself. Fear was a cold, hard knot in Alara's stomach. But something else rose to meet it. The power that had cracked the stones beneath her was still humming in her veins. It was a part of her. The sound, the voice. She did not run. As the guards fell back, as the beast raised its claws to strike again, she walked forward. She did not scream. She did not command. She remembered a cold night in a tiny cottage, a shivering man lost in a nightmare. She remembered the simple, wordless melody that had brought him peace. She opened her mouth and she whispered, "Theron." Her voice was quiet, barely a breath of sound in the chaos. But it was not normal sound. It was imbued with the power that had just shattered stone. It cut through the beast's roar, through the crash of falling masonry, through the screams of the terrified. It was a thread of pure, focused intent. It was not aimed at the beast. It was aimed at the man trapped within it. The monstrous form froze, its claws inches from demolishing another wall. Its burning eyes swiveled to fix on her. The mindless rage in them faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. She took another step closer. She was trembling, but her voice was steady. She began to hum, the same simple, soothing melody from the cottage. It was a sound of safety, of warmth, of home. It was the sound of her love, not the fierce, desperate love the curse fed on, but the quiet, steady love of a healer tending a wound. The shadows around the beast began to churn. It let out a low, pained whine, a sound of conflict. The rage was fighting the calm. The curse was fighting the cure. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice weaving through the notes of the melody. "I'm here. Come back." She held out her hand, not in a gesture of power, but in one of invitation, an offering. The beast lowered its head. The burning light in its eyes dimmed. The monstrous, shadowy form began to recede, pouring back into the man at its center like smoke being drawn into a bottle. It shrank, the shadows dissolving, until all that was left was Theron, kneeling on the cracked stone floor, gasping for breath. He was pale, shaking, and utterly human. He looked up at her, his winter sky eyes filled with awe and disbelief. "Alara," he breathed. The crisis was over. But the threat remained. Morwen stood by the shattered wall, her face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "You!" she shrieked, her voice losing its dry rasp and becoming a venomous hiss. "You were not supposed to be able to do that. The curse is absolute." "It was, wasn't it?" Alara said, her own voice ringing with a newfound strength. Her power was still thrumming through her, a warm and steady hum. She finally understood. It wasn't about fighting or mending. Her magic was her voice, a voice that could shatter or soothe. A curse of love, broken by a sound of love. You never anticipated that. "I will kill you myself!" Morwen screamed, and her form began to twist, her skin withering, her eyes glowing with a malevolent green light. The ancient witch shed her disguise. But before she could unleash whatever dark magic she possessed, Theron was on his feet. He moved with a speed that was terrifying, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. He seized the witch by the throat, his hand a vice of iron. "You poisoned my family," he snarled, his voice a low, deadly growl. "You killed my father. You took my sister. You tried to take her." He squeezed, and the witch's struggles ceased. There was a sickening crack, and he let her lifeless body fall to the floor. Silence descended on the ruined hall. The surviving guards stared dumbfounded. Theron stood over the witch's body, his chest heaving. Then he turned, and his eyes found Alara's. He crossed the room and fell to his knees before her, taking her hands in his. "You saved me," he whispered, pressing his forehead to their joined hands. "Not just from the beast. You saved me from the cold, from the loneliness. You saved my soul." "And you saved me," she whispered back, tears finally streaming down her face. "You made me see that I was not nothing." He looked up at her, his face wrecked with a century of pain and a moment of pure, unadulterated love. "I love you, Alara. Even if it kills me, I love you." "It won't," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that calmed the very air around them. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the curse, a cold, dormant thing deep within him, but she could also feel her own power, a warm, resonant hum. "It won't kill you, because I am here. Your beast will never be a monster again. It will only be a part of you, and I will be the one to soothe it." Weeks later, the castle was still being repaired, but the chill was gone from its stones. The court, having witnessed the miracle in the Great Hall, now looked at Alara with awe and reverence. She was not the king's weakness. She was his strength, his anchor, his queen. One morning, she stood with Theron on a high balcony, looking out over the archipelago. The sun was rising, painting the sea and sky in hues of gold and rose. He came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was warm. The internal cold that had plagued him for a century was gone, silenced by the song only she could sing. "They are calling you the Whisper Queen," he murmured into her hair. She smiled, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "I rather like it." She had been an outcast, a nobody. Now she had a name, a home, a purpose. She had a king who loved her, and a kingdom that was slowly learning to love her too. "The curse is not broken," he said quietly, a sliver of his old fear in his voice. "It is only sleeping." "Then we will let it sleep," she said, her own voice a calm, soothing whisper that was more powerful than any sword or crown. "And if it ever stirs, I will be here to sing it back to sleep." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. "We are not broken, Theron. We are just two halves of the same song. He leaned down and kissed her. A kiss that held the promise of 1,000 sunrises, of a future free from cold and silence. The world had tried to break them both, to render them worthless and alone. But together, they had found their voice, and it was the most powerful magic of all.